You've just entered the Savage Fitness Podcast. The following is a raw, unfiltered, no bullshit look at the fitness industry's most relevant and trending issues. Viewer discretion is advised.
What's going on, Savages? Welcome back to the Savage Talk Podcast. In this episode, we are going to be unpacking hypertrophy, or at least discussing hypertrophy as a follow-up or providing context, piggybacking off of our last podcast. If you guys missed the last podcast, we had a little week or 2-week gap actually since the last one, so you might have to dig back. But I interviewed with a good friend of mine, a highly respected academic in this field, Mr. Dylan Schodel. Now, Dylan is a really close friend of mine, might as well be family. But he is somebody that I love talking about this stuff with because he the way his mind works is very multifaceted. I think he appreciates the nuance and the gray area that's involved in this industry, and it's just it's always a good time. And I think in a lot of ways, some of the ways that he explores concepts they're not always just. I think if you were to separate. You have kind of the conscious foot in, and then you have the subconscious. That subconscious is almost that's the creator. That's the creative. That's people trying to find kind of a new, different way of looking at something or inventing something or whatever, right? So I think because he can explore that pretty well, I think this is really inspiring to me because I find myself hearing some of his concepts and really taking me on a journey to maybe learn more or appreciate more about something that maybe I thought I knew. And so anyway, it's just, again, he's got that kind of thing that I think he looks outside the box pretty organically, which is really good. And that's something that I can really thrive off of being around that. So in the last podcast, to recap, if you didn't watch that, Dylan he wanted to revisit the concept around intensity and hypertrophy. Intensity would be kind of the measurement of overall, really the amount of effort that has gone into each one of your reps or sets, right? So, we measure this maybe percentage based off of a relative intensity off of your maybe 1 rep max. So, you're going to do 70% of your 1 rep max predicted for 5 reps. We might also do this a bit more subjectively, like a RPE scale. So this is kind of taking into consideration the client's feeling, but also still trying to tie that to a bit of data that can be tracked or understood. So RPE would be like, go to an RPE 8, which means essentially, if you were using kind of the reps and reserve model, essentially that means you could have done 2 more reps if you needed to. So it's a scale, but it still takes into consideration a little bit of flexibility of the person's acute situation. So that's intensity. Now, again, we can go further into intensity. I don't think we need to. But ultimately, he wanted to revisit intensity because what he was proposing is that instead of us looking at a calculation of, say, overall work volume, so when we're gauging, say, a hypertrophy program, we might say, there's going to be a collective 400 repetitions of work in this week, or 10 sets of work per body part, in this week, or whatever it may be. But volume is, sets times reps times weight lifted. There might be other ways of gauging that as well, but essentially it's trying to take a data point for the overall work being done. And what he was saying is that instead of looking at overall volume as kind of our metric for hypertrophy, we should really be considering the reps or the volume that's collected that counts, the ones that really are the effective ones. So effective reps or effective work. And this was the first time for me that I had heard this concept proposed. I'm going to get into why I feel a bit stupid, and this happens to me periodically as a fitness professional. But this is the first time I had heard this proposed, and it really kind of set me back because I was like, wow, I can kind of see I can see where you're coming from, right? This was one of those moments that I felt like his maybe looking at it from a different vantage point inspired me to maybe reconsider my traditional beliefs, or to kind of go back to the drawing board. But I wanted to understand more. I really wanted to get it. And so what he was essentially saying, his perception of this, or his concept, is that, anything above, say, an RPE 7, meaning, RPE 7 means you could have done 3 more reps, but anything above, say, that RPE 7 is an effective rep, or that's work that's paying into hypertrophy. That anything prior to that, really, you haven't gotten to the intensity measurement or the intensity measurement metric that is going to be, paying into the bucket of hypertrophy. So it's not really about doing 400 reps of, say, the week or whatever, or 10 sets. It's how many of those reps we can get that pay to hypertrophy. And so go listen to his podcast. He explains it, a little better. Obviously, I want, get it from the horse's mouth. But again, I hadn't heard this concept, and I was like, okay, this is interesting, but I want to understand why. I need to really understand why. Now, come to find out, this is where I feel stupid. This obviously was a catalyst to trigger me to get into the weeds of revisiting hypertrophy. I went back to the drawing board, took myself back to school. Come to find out. Now, this isn't to take anything away from Dylan, because, I genuinely believe, as far as I can tell, that this was this is an original thought process of his. But this has been something that's been talked about within the industry for the last year, maybe a couple of years now. So, there are others that are actually talking about this as well, and some pretty well-known names. I mean, I don't think it's widely spread or widely accepted, but you have like guys like Greg Nuckols, who I think is one of the more prominent ones talking about effective reps. And he has a model, I believe, like above RPE 5 or something like that. But he has a concept around that. And I think he's even done podcasts where he, talks about the flaws of it, or maybe why it might not be what he thought it is. And, and again, I'm not going to get into everybody's philosophies. James Krieger is another one that apparently has a concept around this methodology. But I felt kind of dumb, because I think, spending 13 years in the industry and really feeling like, you've explored a lot, and I do keep up with academia as much as possible. I'm always trying to learn. But it's funny to see how things like this kind of slip by. You're like, how have I not heard about this already? And anyway, I hadn't. So I was getting caught up. The last couple of weeks for me have been literally just turning over as many rocks to see what crawls out when it comes to muscle hypertrophy in the most recent data, or the most recent discussions and theories over this past couple of years. So I learned a lot. This really opened up a whole new world for me. I'm not ready to sit here and tell you where I 100% stand. I am essentially writing down my philosophies, my point of view, my vantage point when it comes to muscle hypertrophy. I am cataloging essentially where my head's at, and where Savage Coaching, I think, at this point is going to approach hypertrophy. And I think this will be practical implications. There will be obviously some programming theories and recommendations around that. There's a lot of things that I think I've already changed my mind on at this point. Like from what I was traditionally thinking, I think I've really reconsidered a ton of stuff. I don't want to say flip my world upside down completely with hypertrophy. I mean, there's really basic mechanisms that I think are true to muscle growth. And I think that we're probably not going to any large scale really get around those fundamentals. And that's why, the typical bro split, or the guy just going in and training fucking hard and eating enough, is going to experience hypertrophy. I mean, there's a bit of, dummy proof, if you will, or the obvious, components that are there. With that said, because I am a fitness professional and I pride myself on trying to have, unique programming, I like to dial things into the most detailed process just for the sake of doing it. I mean, to me, it's fun. Like I could write a bro split and I could get people results, and then I could stop, doing anything else. And for the most part, people probably get results. I find it fun though, to really, get a bit more pretentious in the industry, try to dig in and, add a little cherry on top, or make it fancy. Cause I like the little details. I like the nuances. So this is my long way around saying I first realized that effective reps was being discussed, but it still didn't really, it didn't highlight, like, let's say that, you are doing a set of 10. And on one hand, we count the set of 10 as a metric for hypertrophy. This is kind of the traditional look at it. And in the total sets that you would get in the total reps in that workout is really what we're gauging as far as whether or not you're optimizing hypertrophy. And on the other hand, that set of 10, really only 3 of those reps, let's say, just spitballing numbers, only 3 of them was effective, or maybe 5 of them were effective. Okay, that's another metric. My question was, though, is like, what is causing that? Like, what would, if that is true, not suggesting it's true, where is the practicality to it, and why is it true? Like, what exactly is happening here? And so I kind of had this epiphany. And again, this is me. There's layers of me feeling stupid as a fitness professional, by the way, through all this. Ironically, I'm very thankful for that. I know that probably sounds ridiculous. Nobody likes to feel like they're stupid. In this case, I'm glad. But my next layer of feeling stupid, outside of realizing that people were talking about effective reps, I just wasn't paying attention, would be that I really don't know as much about muscle hypertrophy as I thought. I mean, and I think to take it a step further, give myself a minor little bit of credit so my ego doesn't totally get trashed here. I think a lot of people have no deeper, there are very few people that I believe that I know, that both fitness professionals, clients, athletes, that probably have an appreciation for muscle hypertrophy in the next layers of what I started to look into. I just, I'm thinking, well, why would these 5 reps versus the whole 10 reps? Like, why does that matter? Or why would a drop set maybe be more hypertrophic if I can, I can squeeze these in above this intensity marker, but why does that matter? And I'm thinking, well, we know muscle hypertrophy, we experience skeletal muscle hypertrophy. So the muscle cell itself increases in diameter, or increases in size, I should say. So the total volume of it increases. We are pretty positive that we have very little evidence, if any, to support hyperplasia, which is the splitting of muscle cells. And then what triggers that? Well, most textbooks and most kind of the at least the surface level of the conversation is training volume and being able to recover from that. You could go super basic and say, well, it's between 10 and 12 reps, or 8 and 12 reps, and 60-second to 90-second rests between sets. And, there's these generalized concepts. And then you could even go a little further where people are like, no, you can do more reps than that, or you can actually get big by maybe lifting heavy. But these people are still kind of just looking at it by saying, well, accumulation of volume is really the trigger. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but it still doesn't address the why, right? Like, for me, I don't know why. I'm an idiot. I just hadn't really explored the deeper why. All right. This basically had me go real regress. I feel like I keep regressing back, like I'm having to take my back. I started you got to go back to high school. Then I had to go back to middle school. And then back in middle school, I find myself in biology. So I'm going back to the biology, textbook, trying to say, okay, let's look at the triggers for hypertrophy. Let's really understand what's happening with muscle growth. It was here that I'm realizing it is amazing to me how infant we are with this research. Not to say there's not a lot out there. There's a lot of hypertrophy research, but it's pretty telling when you realize that as early as the 90s, we were chasing a red herring of a concept of muscle hypertrophy regarding acute hormone production that turned out to be completely not correct, just for us to go back to a speculation that was actually proposed in the 80s, saying that muscle tension is most likely the primary driver, or the primary reason why that we experience muscle hypertrophy. So anyway, it was interesting to me to see how, how little we knew and how new some of this information is relatively. So when you look at it, essentially most people are going to accept that there's three possibilities, or at least three accepted kind of concepts of why we probably experience hypertrophy. Muscle tension, as I mentioned, is the primary. That's the one that I think we can probably put a pin in at this point and say, yeah, that's where we're pretty confident there. Now that can be split up into active and passive tension. I thought that was interesting. That opened up a whole new world that then kind of split into other layers with me. But basically, you can providing tension on the muscle is going to be a driver, both in a passive as well as an active collective tension is going to be the main one. The second one is potentially metabolic stress. Metabolic stress. Think of the pump. Right, you get a pump. There's a swelling, and there's kind of there's transfers. There's other things that are going on within the cell. Some people call this, the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is also a speculative kind of concept that's being explored a little bit. But the hydration, the glycogen stores, the lactate that's being accumulated during your set, that there's something about this that could potentially be a driver of hypertrophy. Now, this is less stood behind. I would say, like, if you started with muscle tension and said, man, we've got like a 90% confidence here, probably more like maybe 50-40% confidence, when it comes to metabolic stress. It seems to me that there just needs to be more. There's some like rat studies, for instance, where they injected lactate and actually saw changes in muscle hypertrophy when compared to non-lactate groups. But that doesn't necessarily, we also see examples of hyperplasia, which we can't reproduce in humans either. And, you got to take it with a grain of salt, but interesting nonetheless. The last one is muscle damage. Now, muscle damage, as far as I can tell right now, I don't feel confident that this is a driver of hypertrophy. Some people believe that it could have some merit to it. Maybe we change our mind. But more than likely, it does seem that's probably, if we had 40% on the metabolic stress, we're probably sitting at 10%, at 5%. I think there's a lot of people that are probably saying at this point there's some interesting studies that really show that not only is it probably not the reason why we grow, but it also could be keeping us from growing, or even having an opposite effect to a certain measure. All right. So you get into that, right? So I'm like, okay, this is interesting. But then I'm like, well, yeah, that's great. Okay, muscle tension, but what's exactly happening? Right? Because you think like, well, myofibril hypertrophy is what some people call it, or muscle fiber hypertrophy. It's like the stuff, the proteins, the myosin, the actin, there's growth there. And then sarcoplasmic hypertrophy would be that concept of like just more stuff kind of being packed in there, more of like the waterlogged, if you will, cell. But I'm like, okay, well, but what's happening? Let's just take myofibril. Let's take the muscle fiber hypertrophy. What exactly is happening? Interestingly enough, there is multiple ways that we experience hypertrophy on the filament level. So, if you look at a total muscle, inside of that, we have these fascicles, which are then lined and full of multiple muscle cells, or muscle fibers, as we call them. Muscle fibers, muscle cells, same thing. Inside of the muscle cell, you have another layer where it's myofibrils. And myofibrils run the length of the muscle, of each of the muscle cells, and it makes up the whole content. So they're parallel to one another, making up the volume or the density of the muscle cell, and they run the length of it. And each one of the myofibrils is basically a series of these sarcomeres in conjunction. They're in series. So they're lined up just like a big, long accordion, essentially, down the length of the myofibril. What I found to be interesting was not only do we experience muscle hypertrophy by the splitting of these myofibrils. So if you have one of those series, they can split and create another myofibril next to it. So, in parallel to one another, which would increase muscle density. But we also experience muscle hypertrophy at the length, or at the end of the myofibril. So we basically can add on sarcomeres in series, in conjunction to one another. So we experience hypertrophy at lengthwise as well as density-wise. Now, all of this pays into overall muscle volume. But it definitely throws an interesting wrench in there because now you can actually even look at certain research that maybe like a biopsy that takes is trying to find some sort of reason why this mechanism or that mechanism is causing hypertrophy. Well, the results may be missing some of the information because in a biopsy, you might not be considering, say, the length of the muscle or the end units of the muscle. You might be just kind of going down and looking at you're basically measuring the density of the parallel, change, but you're not really considering the other parts of the volume change. Now we have other ways of measuring like MRI that considers muscle volume, but it's just interesting because you wonder, before even us looking at that, how many studies maybe were missing certain kind of potential variables that could have changed our minds. So it turns out that passive tension, kind of let's say like a stretch or a long range of motion, is increasing the length of the motor unit. So it's essentially, imagine just kind of pulling at the end of the muscle, which would basically lead to an additive of sarcomeres to the end of the myofibrils. But because the connective tissue is going to stay in the same place, or we're not going to get some major plastic stretch from the connective tissue, that means it's like a tall guy sitting in a small car. So even though you're like, oh, well, I want dense muscles, I don't want long muscles. Like, well, it's keep in mind we're basically just packing it all in, so you're still going to have that overall volume of muscle change in the way that you're probably thinking. Now, the passive tension, the stretch, the long range of motion, that's again length, but it seems that active versions, so concentric and eccentric, basically the connective of the actin and myosin inside of the sarcomeres, is what's really going to drive some of that other splitting, right? The kind of parallel splitting or the density. So this basically right away, right up front, should anybody that's tracking here, you're probably realizing, well, now tempo and range of motion are going to be heavily involved in your ability to grow. We have to consider these two things now. I mean, you going through an exaggerated range of motion may increase muscle hypertrophy by adding more passive tension into the bucket of overall tension. You also might want to consider potentially a more controlled tempo or a more intentional tempo due to kind of creating more active tension. So anyway, and again, this is me broadly talking because I'm not prepared to actually give my suggestions yet, but that's where I'm kind of going with all this research and trying to understand it. All right, so we've got that. Then you look at, say, the metabolic stressors. We don't know 100% that metabolic stress is, one of the mechanisms. It's possible, though. We know that these byproducts are going to exist whenever we train at a certain intensity measure for sure at some point. So this leads me to believe that there may actually be some decent merit to potentially throwing in some exaggerated high rep sets or drop sets, actually maybe some of the things that Dylan was proposing, every once in a while to intentionally increase kind of metabolic overload or metabolic stress. Going to a set of 30, for instance, or some sort of serious drop set, you kind of have this intense, crazy pump, and you're forcing really more byproduct in there in a given time. And if lactate or some other byproduct it has anything to do with hypertrophy, that would be a good way to at least address that. Now, my issue is it also seems that we adapt to it relatively easy or relatively quickly. So I don't really see a lot of benefit as of now. Again, I'm not tying myself to anything. All right. I want to make this very clear because I might change my mind, but I don't feel like, it doesn't seem to me that doing this regularly every week would really be ideal, but just periodically. As a matter of fact, this is also why it seems that occlusion training, the kind of, tying off at the joint or whatever and kind of forcing this pump by doing this kind of almost tourniquet style training, believe it or not, has some evidence to support it and back it. And it might actually have to do with some of this metabolic stress. So, and now going to muscle damage, where I'm at right now anyway with muscle damage is I'm not really behind it, if we're being quite frank. And as a matter of fact, I believe that, kind of like I've thought in the past, that it's possible that going to a point of muscle damage, which by the way, it is different. Muscle damage and hypertrophy are two different things. I feel like we tie ourselves to this idea that what we're doing is we're tearing the muscle, and we do have a certain type of damage, I guess. But the way that a muscle cell damage would be defined in the literature, or like the proper way to look at it, is not the same as, say, the splitting of myofibrils or the length of the myofibrils actually increasing that, even though if you want to classify that as damage, it kind of, when you look at, like, say, a muscle cell, there are examples in certain studies of these kind of, what do you call them? They're basically splitting of the ends of the muscle cell. So you would have one muscle cell, and again, full of myofibrils, but towards the end of it, there's basically a breaking apart. So you have like a tail of two, right, coming off of there. These kind of fissures, if you will. That seems to be a kind of an in-between spot of muscle regeneration, and so that would then heal together, and you would have a larger collective muscle cell. So you could call that damage if you want. But when I say damage, I'm talking going to that set of failure to the point at which you're experiencing this like crazy DOMs and just some of the fatigue that is probably making it so that you can't get more work, or at least effective work on the muscle over time or over the week. And so this might actually be negatively affecting your work. So I've already kind of been there. I think that avoiding, dropped a little thing I was fidgeting with. But I think overall, avoiding going too far is probably still reasonable. Now, I do think that we need to flirt with failure a little bit more than what I was thinking. I'm kind of like, at this point, what I'm realizing is that, really just calculating really the amount, the numbers, though it might be decent bumpers, it doesn't really mean that that's going to give me the best results. I could be over or under reaching in a different way than I would have considered. And so there's a bit more intuitiveness to it. But more is not better, and less isn't better either. I think there's a way to play this too conservatively, where you're staying away from failure for the hope to accumulate more volume throughout the week, but those numbers really are irrelevant, given that it seems that just inside the rep, creating as much tension, passive and active, as possible over time is really the game, but then not overdoing it. So anyway, look, this is where I'm at right now. I thought this would be a decent podcast for those of you guys that nerd out, want maybe kind of some of this thought process, and I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts down below. I am going to continue my rabbit hole. Every time I turn up a rock, other things keep crawling out, and I like it. I'm with it, even though that sounds weird. But anyway, that's the episode for today. I've got a lot more coming. We are going to have some, I'm going to have a system, a concepts kind of, I want to lay out just like other programs have. I'm not saying that, we're going to be somehow special. Hell, you can find something for everybody out there now, and I'm damn sure not the smartest guy, and there are plenty of programs out there, but I want to establish where Savage Coaching stands based off of the data and the current understanding of the research from our vantage point as well as our experience. And I want to put that together, but I want to make sure that I'm actually really looking at this from as many sides as possible, and taking into as many considerations as possible as I can. But once I have that, then I'm going to let you guys know, and we'll keep the discussion rolling. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe wherever you might be. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can check this out on Spotify. If you're on Spotify, you can go watch it on YouTube. I don't know if it's necessary to have to watch me talk into a microphone, but if you want to, shit, actually, that's how I do it. All right, we'll catch you guys later. Bye.